Hi everyone, I am reading Cat's Conundrum, Raven and Hummingbird, Book 3 by Nikki Broadwell, presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Prologue. Bones rattled as the witch shook the bag and muttered her questions. She pulled the drawstring open and let them scatter across the dirt floor, the action causing the candle to flicker and nearly go out. "It is as I thought," she mumbled, her gaze moving from the bones to the shadow on the cave wall. "I will make you whole again, and when I do, you will assist me." She moved the candle in its holder and examined the bones again, gnarled fingers running through her matted gray hair. "They tell me that I am the one who will bring down the world. Once I am finished, the world will reflect what I and others like me want." She rose from where she kneeled. "But first I must stop the girl who has come from the gods' loins. She is my nemesis and my trial. If she succeeds, I will fail." She glanced down again. "And I cannot fail." She bent to gather the bones together, replacing them in the velvet bag. Turning, she placed her hand on the wall where the shadow hovered. "Soon, my love. We will be together very soon." Outside the cave, the wind came up, howling like wild dogs. The candle blew out, plunging the cave into darkness. 1. The note said, "My dearest Cattell, my time on earth has abruptly been brought to a close, and I have gone home to the underworld and the duties I left behind. Do not seek me there. If you do, it will be at your own peril. Your father has been stripped of his powers and locked away where he can never again do damage. The borders have closed, the worlds of gods and humans separated forever. I have no insight left to impart, only that you must listen to your own heart and the wisdom of the forest. Use the gifts given you." Cat stared at the square of white left on the bare counter of what had been Cerwin's cosmetic cauldron. She'd been working here off and on for over 2 years and trying her best to learn what it meant to be a demigoddess. Aramid, her teacher in the fine arts of goddess powers, had left months before, heading home to Otherworld to fight the darkness that had crept through the opening between worlds. The shelves were empty now, with no remnant of the creams and essential oils Cerwin had concocted from the herbs and seeds Cat had collected in the forest. All that was left was dust. A sinking sensation entered her, anxiety making its way into the pit of her stomach. She hadn't realized how much this woman's presence had soothed her, how the work had kept her mind off disturbing events and buoyed her moods. Why hadn't the crone goddess mentioned her impending departure, or for that matter, the terrible news that Bran would not be allowed to return? Her mother and baby brother were thousands of miles away, and from what the note said, the love of her life might be banned from her ever coming back. Her thoughts turned to her immediate plight, the weighty sense that it was up to her to get rid of the dope and stop whatever was creeping over the land. According to Gwen, it was her destiny, but without the support of Gwen and Aramid, she felt lost, especially since Dagda was no longer around to piss her off and bring out what was lurking beneath the surface. Her powers seemed to arise unbidden when she was around him, fury with her father sparking them. Anger rose up at the damage that had been done to her, the goddess's decision to have Bran live with her as a teenage boy, his disappearance into the nether realms of the Norse world to find himself again. If it hadn't been for her, Bran would be dead now. The loss of his presence in her life was worse than any of the others. She was now utterly alone. Cat walked out of the empty shop, her troubled gaze going to the smoke rising from the forest in the distance, the blank faces of those walking by, and the proselytizers carrying signs with messages about repenting in the end of days. The lead up to all this had taken many months in which she'd been missing Bran and waiting impatiently for his return. The dupe were here, their amorphous shapes wafting by in the increasingly gray world. They looked like ghosts, with their pale, ever-changing bodies. But that was not what they were. Ghosts did not suck the life out of the world, leaving it cold and dead. According to Cerwin, they were not the problem. They were merely a symptom. If they weren't the problem, what was? In Cat's mind, leaching the color out of everything alive was no small thing. Many of the people she saw were numbed out and blank. The temperatures had dropped. The days shortened, and the nights so cold that no amount of heat could keep out the chill. Those who were resistant to the dew were the ones carrying signs and seeing evil everywhere, and the others had apparently lost their senses. Was there something more malevolent waiting at the edges of the world to wreak even more havoc? Last time Kat had spoken with her, Sidwin had feigned innocence when asked what was happening in Otherworld, how the trial of Dagda, Kat's father, was going. Considering her own intervention, Kat had assumed that things would work out for her father. She had made a special trip to Otherworld to plead his case, citing his love for her mother as the reason to be lenient. If it wasn't for her newfound ability to shift into a hummingbird, she would not have found her way to Otherworld. Some small kernel of knowing arising once she was in bird form. He did what a god would do, faced with the life on earth, she told the group of gods and goddesses she addressed. He fell in love with a human woman and lost his wits in the process, embracing the greed of money and power that has become the main purpose of life on earth. Kat remembered the shocked faces when they heard about what earth was like. Their expressions saying they all had power, but they did not wield it for personal gain. When Kat went on, they watched her, their eyes wide with interest. But he changed, and he's been racked with guilt, she'd told them, not to mention heartbroken over having to leave the love of his life and 2 half-god children. The last statement had sent murmurs rushing through the group as they discussed her message. Kat had waited for questions, but none were asked. But she'd left out one important detail. The real reason for her father's guilt and shame had been caused by her mother rejecting him. Later, when she was back on Earth and Bran had been called upon to participate in her father's trial and sentencing, she'd assumed he would be gone a week, or possibly 2. When a month went by, and then another, she'd felt his absence keenly. But with this news, anxiety came rushing to the surface. If the border was really closed, she might never see him again. As Hummingbird, she'd made it there once. Why not try again? She nodded to herself. It was the only idea that made any sense. Kat's tiny gossamer wings beat against the invisible barrier, her hummingbird heart racing. There was no getting through whatever this was, and in her current state she had no alternatives other than to return to Earth. When she reached the ground and returned back to human form, the seriousness of the situation penetrated. She had been so sure that as a demigoddess she could pass through into Otherworld, and she'd done it before in bird form, but now she realized that what Serdwin had said in her note was the truth. The worlds of gods and humans were separated forever. It was dark by the time she reached her apartment. Her body like lead as she took one slow step after another. At home she pulled the crumpled note out of her pocket, the words blurring through her tears. When the paper grew hot and caught fire, she dropped it. Staring in horror at the pile of ash on the floor at her feet, she lay on her bed and gave herself over to grief, finally falling into a stupor like sleep. Kat woke to gray light. The words of Serdwin's note emblazoned in her mind. Listen to your own heart and the wisdom of the forest. She grabbed a jacket and ran from the apartment, ignoring the cold wind that blasted her in the face as she skimmed the distance at a run. The trees taunted her as she entered the woods. The towering, leafless gray limbs seemed like a testament of utility. Kat picked her way over burned stumps, skirting around trees that looked ready to topple over, following a former deer path deeper into the forest. There had to be some green left somewhere, some area that the dew had missed in their greedy search. What they wanted was beyond her understanding. She'd never had any personal dealings with them, but they eyed her from time to time, their eyes empty as they waved goodbye. In the distance, she spotted a few old-growth trees, their trunks gray but the branches at the top still green. She hurried toward them, allowing her scattered thoughts to drift away. Communicating with trees was a tricky business, one that required a clear mind and a ton of patience. Trees were ancient, and what they had absorbed over their years was not readily given. She slowed her steps as she approached the gnarled trunks, bowing her head in respect. These beings had been here for hundreds of years and would be here for 100 more, barring fires or hurricanes or tornadoes uprooting them. Would the dew finally be the ones to kill them? Some had already burned, scars lining the trunks, but they persisted despite it all. As she asked for guidance, the pointlessness settled into her. Her approach had to be in keeping with what they were. Trees didn't think in human terms, nor were they conscious of the puny dealings of what went on in the world of humans. They communicated amongst themselves, keeping away pests by sending out scents, drawing helpful predators to them in the same way, and filling their leaves with toxins to fend off unwanted insects and leaf-eaters of all kinds. They bloomed at the same time to widen the gene pool, and moved south or north depending on the warming or chilling of the environment around them. They exchanged information and nutrients with help from fungi and worked with whatever foraged on their leaves and roots, communicating with others of their species through the web of their roots. Cat was awed by their size and age and how they functioned. She sat on the ground next to a particularly enormous cedar, one that she viewed as a centennial. Its crown rose higher than all the others, an aura of age and wisdom emanating from it. When she placed her hand on the gnarled bark, she could feel the energy coursing through it. It was very much alive. She breathed in and out, waiting. The sky turned dark, the silence of the forest and the smell of dead leaves and burned wood settling into her. Hours moved slowly by, her crossed legs going numb as her mind opened and cleared. When her mother appeared in her mind with an expression of fear on her face, Kat's eyes flew open. Something was amiss. She didn't know if the vision had come from the trees or not, only that she was needed. Her knees ached when she rose from the ground, her hands going together to thank the trees before she sprinted away. 2. Dagda had accepted his punishment, ready to be imprisoned inside the tower for all eternity. It was what he deserved. So when he was told that instead of that his powers would be stripped and he would be sent back to Earth as a human, he argued, "I want to stay here as God. You can put me anywhere. I don't care. Just please don't take my powers." Horstai, the judge, scoffed. "And how can we keep you locked in a tower if you have powers, Dagda? You can bind them." Horstai shook his head. "Your daughter has convinced us of your love for this Earth woman. We are giving you a second chance." "I don't want a second chance. What I did down there, I would rather die than go back." But no amount of pleading would change their minds. And so, the borders were open to expel him from Otherworld onto an Earth depleted of color. He was heartsick, disgusted with himself and angry with his fate. At first he wandered aimlessly, hoping that he would simply die. Sleeping on park benches and in doorways was not only uncomfortable, but also led to several bad confrontations with those who saw him as a bum. He wanted to argue, wanted to turn them into toads or send them sprawling, but when he lifted his hand, nothing happened. He caught a cold and coughed for weeks, his lungs burning as though they were on fire. His head was hot, but he felt chilled to the bone, shivering as he was roused by the police. When he questioned them about his symptoms, wondering what it meant, they laughed at him. After a month of this, when he became so emaciated that he could barely get around, he searched out his former property, surprised to find it brimming with color. The rest of his street had turned a dull gray, and many of the people had simply vacated their houses. Maybe it was his former power still infused into the land that kept it alive, or maybe Cat had been here and worked her magic. It was an oasis in a world that held nothing for him. The next day he began the slow assembling of scrap wood into a shack to protect him from the elements. A god who had never experienced cold was now shivering through the night, and the hunger that turned his belly into a beast was even worse. As the endless days passed by, his body turned into a mass of pain, his hands blistered and bleeding from carrying the rough wood. Being forced to rely on muscle and will was new to him and not at all welcome. Emptiness seeping around the corners of his mind. He'd stolen tools from a house close by, also making off with some scraps he found in a shed, behind one of the beautiful mansions, so like the one he'd created as a god. He found moldy bread and canned goods in the houses that had been abandoned, his hunger finally at bay. The ashes still remained from the fire he'd set that night. The beautiful house that he'd conjured for Sivan was gone, as though it had never been. He wondered how humans could stand all the pain they went through. Not only the hunger and the constant aching, but also the emotions that he was fraught with every moment of every day. It was nearly unbearable. One minute he'd be working, and in the next, he was overcome with a hopelessness that hung off of him like sticky vines. He'd begun to drink. His forays to the local bar made easier once he learned how to beg for loose change. How far he had fallen.